I am going to ask for quiet, not because I'm interested in hearing myself speak, which I assure you I am not, but rather on the chance that we can imagine, perhaps even audibly imagine, the voices from this building, from upstairs in the cafeteria, this room, and most importantly, the studios below. And those are the voices of O'Keeffe and Pollock, Rothko, Gorky, the voices which shape modernism. And more importantly than their voices, through their paintings and their sculpture, they created a modernism which was so powerful, so attractive, that it is for us ubiquitous. And ubiquitous to the extent that we have trouble seeing it objectively. Denise Murrell, the curator of Posing Modernity, is going to help us with that. She, through Heideggerian effort, if you will, has given us an exhibition which helps us see us through these paintings, and then how both those paintings and us are embedded in this world culturally. And that exhibition has been much celebrated. Roberta Smith and others have said it was one of the most outstanding exhibitions of 2018. It will shortly take up residence at the Musee D'Orsay. So Denise, let me lead the applause for you, and thank you for coming to our home.
Thank you, Michael and Jennifer, and everyone who has come out to join us this evening in what I hope is going to be a discussion. I'm going to work very hard to do something that's difficult for recent PhDs after having written tomes as our dissertation and then as the exhibition catalog, and I'm going to try to be relatively brief. I'd like to show you a series of images that I think will give you a good overview of the exhibition now on view at the Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia University. I'm going to make a few comments just showing how I was thinking as I brought these images together. But just moving to this first image, this portrayal of a young black woman who the artist identified as Laura, but whose name is generally not known in art history. The principle, the premise of the entire exhibition, Posing Modernity, the black model from Manet and Matisse to today, is based on a legacy that I discovered as I looked at this figure who poses the maid in Olympia, who is standing there right before us, but who is most typically ignored in art historical commentary. A woman who is therefore rendered invisible even though she is in plain view. But this portrayal was so radically innovative and so powerful that it influenced successive generations of artists. And that is what I want to look at today. What was it about this particular figure that was so new and different and controversial in its own time? And then how did it influence artists over successive generations from the artists of Manet's own time the acolytes of Manet, who ultimately became the Impressionists, to the School of Paris, specifically Henri Matisse, in the beginning of the 20th century, who was working at the same time as the early American modernists of the Harlem Renaissance were remaking the imagery of African Americans in this country. And then we go to the mid-20th century, the modernism of Romare Bearden, the African American collagist, who brought influences from Western art, from African art, and from African American culture into his own particular way of imaging the black female figure. And then concluding with the work of the living artists of our own time, who have engaged with this lineage of this iconography, this history, as they experiment and develop pictorial styles or art-making styles that are emblematic of our own time. So that is a subject I want to try to go through. And as I said, it begins with Manet, Edouard Manet, working in 1860s Paris. And one thing that is interesting to keep in mind is that Manet made not one image of Laura. Certainly his portrayal of her as a maid in a high-end brothel is the most famous by far, not just of her, but of any model throughout art history. But he made 3 images of her. A portrait posed as a nanny in tending her young charges in the Jardin des Tuileries in Paris. And it is this combined sort of set of images of Laura that I think give us a sense of what Manet was getting at as he followed the exhortation of his friend, the poet Charles Baudelaire, to be a painter of modern life, to not look to the art of the past or scenes from mythology or biblical or history paintings, but to go out into the streets of the Paris of his own time, to roam the boulevards, go down every alleyway, and paint everything that he observed. The idea that all of this was worthy of fine painting that should be shown at the Salon de Paris at this time. So these 3 images, I think, are emblematic of what it was that made Manet the reason why Manet was considered to be a foundational painter of modern art, and why Olympia was the painting that launched this reputation. In looking at Olympia, I think I wanted to start with a slide that probably many of you in this room have seen. It's a juxtaposition, a comparison that anyone who's taken an Art History 101 course, gone through an art history program, gone through a studio art program, BFA, MFA, sooner or later you're going to see Olympia. And you're typically going to see it in comparison with Titian's Venus of Urbino, which is a late Venetian Renaissance portrayal of a courtesan, the Venus, that was prototypical of the type of portrayal of this trope of the nude object of desire that Manet replicated or was inspired by when he remade this image 3 centuries later. But looking specifically at the maid figure and just doing our basic formal analysis, I was struck myself at the beginning of my art history studies by the difference, just the formal difference in the way that Manet is portraying this figure in comparison with the prototypical maids in the Titian. He has 2 maids, or the Venus of Urbino has 2 maids, but they combined take up less pictorial space than Manet's black maid who's proffering flowers to her employer. They are in the background, in the deep background, turned away from the viewer, leaning over a trousseau. Laura of Olympia is frontal. She is gazing at her employer, but she is facing the viewer and presenting herself to us in a way that I believe meant that Manet intended for us to look at this painting as a painting about two women, one black, one white. The historic analysis going through all the gender and class issues related to the nude white odalisque are certainly relevant and meaningful, but they're part of the story. I came to see, as I really thought about this painting, that Manet has presented Laura to us as emblematic of a racial situation that existed in 1860s Paris at a moment just 15 years after the final French abolition of territorial slavery. So that was what pulled me into this. I became curious to understand if Laura is moving this pictorial imagery from the Renaissance into everyday 1860s Paris, what is it that she represents? And one thing I would point out, just looking at this close-up of her, is that Laura is very well painted. One of the items or one of the aspects of postmodernist critique of Manet's portrayal of Laura was that he blended her into the background. And if you see this painting as reproductions in textbooks, and especially if you see it in black and white, you will perhaps have the impression that Manet has marginalized her, has blended her into this kind of murky, in black and white it looks like gray or inky black background. Her features are not that visible. It's very important always to look at a work of art in the original. And I still remember the moment when I first saw this painting about a decade ago at the Musee D'Orsay. And I was just really struck by the fact that she is really very distinct from the background. That background is not black. It's a very vivid green black. It's a blended green black. Her dress is not kind of a monochromatic, indistinct white. It's pink. It has stylish details with the neckline, with the sleeve. Her facial expression really shows that she is engaged. If you go back to this prototypical comparison, if the servants of Titian's Venus of Urbino are totally out of the narrative of what this Venus represents to the viewer, Laura is part of the narrative of this prostitute who is kind of breaking with this convention of being a submissive lover for a patron who is maintaining her in these luxurious circumstances and pretending that it's a love relationship. What she seems to be saying is, look, I'm a working woman. I appreciate these flowers, but we have to work out the business details of this arrangement before anything is going to happen. So what we have here are two paid women who are part of what in the 1860s became known overtly as the sex trade. They are sex workers. They are women from from working class backgrounds who in the economic structure of 1860s Paris found this particular mode of work to be their means to earn a living. So thinking about Laura as a paid worker in this scene of sex work is part of what makes her image modern. She's not subject to complete control by anyone. She's there of her own free volition, and I believe Manet presents her in that way. The second way that you get at thinking about Laura as being part of this modern Paris at a time of enormous change, the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the end of empire, the abolition of territorial slavery, is to compare Manet's portrayal of Olympia not just with the precedent of the Venetian Renaissance, but with the contemporary the standard mode of portraying black women or a woman, period, in the academic art that was typically shown at the Paris Salon. The Paris Salon would be like the Whitney Biennial today. It's what artists, especially younger emerging artists, aimed to be shown at. And the judges who decided what would be shown in this way, unlike the Whitney Biennial, were not necessarily going for the avant-garde, for innovation. They were going for tradition. They were going for academic tradition. And that's what you see in this painting by Jerome, who was known as probably the leading painter of this Orientalist style that was so symbolic of all of the values that were constructed around France as the head of this global empire. So we see these two women in an exotic locale. They're in a harem that may have been observed at some point by Jerome, but these paintings were often made from the imagination, from tales that were told to them by travelers. And we see the portrayal of this black woman in a way that was just very typical of the way these Orientalist paintings shown in the Salon would portray this type of figure. She is first and foremost bare-breasted. She is dressed in beautifully painted, exquisitely painted attire. The entire painting is a visual feast, a contrast of surfaces and textures, all intended to demonstrate the virtuosity of the maker. And that is part of why it was important to paint in this style to be shown at the Salon. But this is a scene that sits outside modern life in Paris. It sits in the heart of the French Empire. And this construction of the black woman as irreducibly in a position of servitude to her white employer, and her white female employer, as completely under the control of the male owners or patrons of this place of sex work. That is what was part of the way that French artists and art historians and politicians visualized and constructed empire. Manet, on the other hand, a known Republican, anti-slavery, for abolition, anti-empire, although it took another number of decades before that actually happened. But the way that he manifested this personal vision, this personal worldview, was to take these scenes, these prototypical scenes, out of scenes of empire and enslavement and place them in the sight of the numerous high-end brothels that dotted the very neighborhood in which Manet and the Impressionists lived and worked at the time. So this contrast between exotic and modern, and between the prototypes of the Renaissance versus everyday life, those are the reasons why this painting is considered to be a foundational painting of modern art. And so when you think about l'art as emblematic of some lived reality that Manet would observe as he worked as a flaneur and went out into the city, went out into his neighborhood and roamed the area and observed life and then portrayed it. This image of l'art, I came to understand, indexed an aspect of reality that he would see just in his everyday life. And we see that not so much in the paintings of the period, which played to the conservative taste of the judges of the Salon, but in the popular culture, in the visual culture, and particularly in photography. So here we have the photographer Nadar, a friend of Manet. The upper left images were iconic. They're part of how we understand today how Manet looked. His friend, Charles Baudelaire, the two men below them, the Alexandre Dumas family, probably the most prominent Black French writers of the day, wealthy from a biracial, but from an aristocratic French paternal line. Dumas the father, the author of the novel The Three Musketeers. Dumas the son, a close friend, same generation as Manet, the author of a play, La Dame aux Camélias, the Woman of Camellia, whose main character, one of whose main characters, was named Olympia, and therefore has been often considered to be an influence for Manet. So we see these personalities in the studio portraits made by Manet's friend Nadar, and they are famous. These are well-known portraits. Less well-known was the astounding variety of portraits of Black French people coming through Nadar's studio as well. And I give you just a small sampling here. We see Marie Lassou, who is the daughter, she's a young student studying in Paris at this time, the daughter of a Black woman from New Orleans and a French father. We see Marie Lentillez, who was an artist model, wearing the traditional velvet V-necked drape of the artist model. We see a matron, a middle-class matron, whose name we don't know. She's identified as the wife of a provincial British mayor, a French woman who is married to the mayor of a small town in England. And we see an actress, a conservatrice, a woman who apparently had received training in drama at the conservatory and was working as a professional actress. And this is just a small sampling of the literally dozens of these portraits of Black French Parisians that were captured by Manet's friend Nadar at the same time that he was photographing the famous artists and writers of the time. Another aspect of this sort of site specificity, this neighborhood, this sense that there was this Black presence in this would be something that Manet would see when he's just out and about in his neighborhood, can be seen in this wonderful painting of an artist studio, a generous loan to us from the Musee D'Orsay. And it portrays the Manet acolyte Basile. I have this pointer here, and he is this tall figure in the middle here, and he is in his studio in an area of northern Paris known as the Batignolles quartier. He shared the studio at the time with another young artist, Renoir, who is considered often, not definitively, but often to be this figure. And they both were close friends with Monet. So we see here Manet, dapper, at the easel, with his, he's living and working in one of the most bohemian neighborhoods in Paris, but he was known for always being very dapperly attired with his bowler hat, his waistcoat, and his walking stick. He stands at the easel. He is advising these young Impressionists. This is made in 1870, so we're still about 5 years from the first Impressionist exhibition. To do what he has been doing, roam the streets, turn away from tradition and history, and go out and take every subject of everyday life as the subject of their art. Also in this neighborhood, the Batignolles, and this would be the area of northern Paris. Once you go past the Opéra Garnier, up past the Gare Saint-Lazare, you're at Place de Clichy. Going east, you pass Place Pigalle. Place Pigalle was then and still is today a famous entertainment district, the Moulin Rouge, the Folies Bergère. And then farther east, you come to the Gare du Nord. So cafes on the main squares where the artists hung out. And as we know from Manet's description of Laure, which not only described her as une très belle négresse, but gave us her address as Rue Ventimille, which is just a block or so below the Place de Clichy. That would be this area here. And we see that Laure herself lived in this immediate neighborhood. We don't know for sure how Manet came into contact with her. We have a couple of clues, and we'll talk about one of them in just a minute. But as I looked at these various black French personalities who were the subjects of paintings, of photography, of sculpture, etc., to the extent that I was able to identify their addresses, which are just very generally mapped out here with the green dots, and then looking at the locations of Manet's cafes and studios, the Café Gerbois, painted by all of the Impressionists. They all gather there every Friday afternoon for a number of years. The Père Latouille over at Place Pigalle, the locations of the studios, including that of Basile in the Rue de la Condamine, noted by the red dots here. And then we look at, I'm fast forwarding a little bit in time here, but those blue dots represent what happened about 50 years after the era of Manet. This was the time when the early generation of African-American expatriate artists, writers, musicians were coming to Paris, studying there, performing there at a time when racism limited their opportunities here in the US. Langston Hughes, Billie Holiday, Josephine Baker, Catherine Dunham, all of them migrated to Paris to live in this particular neighborhood. And their addresses are denoted by the blue dots here. And this is just a sampling of the many, but I think it gives a sense of the racial mix of this neighborhood, so that as these painters of modern life, these flaneurs, Baudelairian flaneurs, are out roaming the streets, they're going to see a mix of free black Parisians. They're going to see, there were actually some earlier versions of African-American expatriates, including the Shakespearean actor Ira Aldrich, who was a very close friend of Dumas Père. But that's what they're going to see, and that's part of why this shows up in their imagery. Just a very quick note to double down on why it's so important to look not just at paintings but at photography is that, again, the paintings cater to the conservative taste of the judges of the salon. And the prototypical portrayal of the black female figure was as a servant to a white employer. But as I went into the archives at the Bibliothèque Nationale, at the Musee D'Orsay, at the museums in France, and collections in the US, looking for other images of black women as servants to these odalisques, what I came across was a body of photography portraying black women in these positions of the odalisque on the same basis as the white prostitutes. So you see on the left here, two women who are being photographed, marketed, if you will, as available. They're socially in the same situation. And then on the right, a portrait made from a high-end brothel that was just a stone's throw from where Manet lived and worked. We see a black woman who is being portrayed as the favorite, or as one of the favorites of the house. There are a series of photos, and they're consistent with these portraits of favorites that were offered to the male patrons who were paying for these expensive, stylish, luxurious accommodations where these sex workers were housed. And they would make portraits of each of these women to give to their patrons. So we see from the popular culture that black women occupied all roles in sex work as they did in the overall society, as seen in Adar's photos. As I mentioned, Manet made 3 portrayals of the black model Laure. And for me, one of the first, most important discoveries of this entire project was coming across his portrait of Laure, known as La Negresse, a racialized anonymous term that is increasingly controversial today, but it was the common usage of the time. One of the reasons that this painting is important is that we see, I think, in an even more elaborated manner, the way that Manet is dealing with Laure as an individual. It is in his carnet, his studio carnet or notebook for the making of this painting that we have this description that is the only information we know about her today. Her name, Laure, that she lived in Rue Ventimille, that he described her as une très belle négresse. So here we see her portrayed as herself. And again, to the extent that this has been, that there has been scholarship about this portrait of Laure, it's often been, dismissed, la négresse, anonymous black woman, even though the artist told us her name in notebooks that were available to all scholars. And she is considered to be a study for Olympia. But again, when I did this juxtaposition, I'm being a good art history student. I'm looking at the images itself and not just what the writers tell me about them. And I will admit, I was helped. I actually did this juxtaposition for a paper for a seminar that I took with Linda Nochlin, the late, great feminist art historian at the NYU IFA. And she was one of the first people who helped me to understand this can't possibly be a study for Olympia. It's not the same pose. She's not wearing the same attire. And then when you look at her, you look at the care with which he's portrayed her face, while being much more general in the depiction of her torso, it's pretty clear that this is consistent with what would be described as a portrait. So one of the things that I suggested in my research is that we get rid of this name, La Négresse, and rename this painting Portrait of Laure. The artist himself told us who she was. We should refer to her as such. But what we also see here, just formally, is part of why Manet was considered to be the patron or the mentor of the Impressionists, the very loose brushstrokes, only the suggestion of her attire. That's actually a quite stylish Second Empire, off-the-shoulder neckline with some embellishment, the flat pleats, the detailing at on the upper sleeves. That was very commonplace in fashion plates of the time. He opts not to depict that in hyper-realistic illusionism. He felt that photography captured the actual image. The job of the painter, the job of an artist was to suggest, to create an impression, and this is part of why the Impressionism ultimately became known as Impressionism, which was a derogatory term initially. It was considered to mean that they didn't know how to paint. They didn't know how to really get the fine details right, so they were only capable of making a very loose image. But this type of expressive, open to the viewer, open to the interpretation of the viewer, portrayal of figures, even in specific portraits, is part of what we came to define as modernism, and it's certainly more typical today of the way contemporary or successive generations of artists, including contemporary artists, would render a portrait, looking for a way to say something as the artist about what you're observing, rather than just meticulously rendering what you see before you. So I've actually already kind of talked about what is so specific about Laure here, just to give you a little bit of a close-up detail. Before we move on to the third portrayal that Manet made of Laure, and it's actually a very sketchy one. The entire image is sketchy. This is definitely a sketch. It's a genre scene. It is titled Children in the Tuileries. It was intended to depict a scene that Manet wrote about observing on an almost daily basis as he walked down from the Place de Clichy, past the Opera, through the Tuileries Gardens, on his way to the Louvre for his almost daily sketching sessions. There were many people out enjoying the parks, like the Tuileries at the time, but one of the typical scenes was that of nannies who were out with their young charges, typically from affluent families. And so it's the attire, more than a specific facial representation, that places us, that tells us who these people are. So we see Laure in the far right side of the canvas, identified mainly by her skin tones. I've compared this with another, there were many scenes, many portrayals of nannies in the Tuileries, in the Parc Monceau, with their young charges. But I was especially drawn to this, in part because when I first found it in the archives at the Harvard Image of the Black publications in Boston, I'd never seen it before. And I quickly came to realize that it was shown at the same salon, 1865, as Olympia. And just again, doing some formal analysis, we weren't able to find a lot of documentation about the maker of that painting, Fayen. But just looking at her, looking at the very few images of Black women that were shown in that particular salon, I thought perhaps this is an indication, another indication, that Laura is a working model who poses for multiple artists. Might this be a more naturalistic, a more realistic portrayal of the model Laura? The other thing I was really drawn to, though, about this painting, in addition to the fact that those kids are really adorable, is the fact that it's a relatively unusual portrayal of two women, black and white, in the same social situation. They're both nannies. And they're both nannies that would have been identified as ethnic at the time. Laura wears the headscarf or foulard in colors typical of the French Caribbean, reflecting this pattern of immigration or migration from the newly freed French colonies of Martinique, Guadeloupe, even from the Republic, the then independent Republic of Haiti, to Paris in search of work, often under employment contracts that were heavily criticized at the time as another form of slavery or as a form of indentured servitude. They paid the cost of the transatlantic transportation, and the employee worked as a domestic servant in the household until these costs were paid off, which happened definitely pretty far into the future. But we also have the white nanny who is wearing the head wrap of the region of Brittany, the northern French rural neighborhood, depicted a couple of decades later by Gauguin. The early work of Gauguin showed how Brittany at the time was considered to be a rural, even primitive. The term primitive was actually used to describe Brittany. So they're both ethnic. Migrants to Paris from working class backgrounds looking for a way to get an economic toehold in life. I just point out these scenes of modern life always have to be looked at in the terms of popular culture at the time. And that culture was often explicitly racist. The portrayal of nannies in particular in caricatures. At the bottom here, we see a caricature of Alexandre Dumas, the father, well-known, famous, but here racially stereotyped as some pretty layered analysis there, but he's shown as this nanny of a particular play in the theater that I believe was based on one of his novels. But that sort of facial stereotyping was not uncommon at all in French popular culture at the time. There are often portraits of these nannies with their white infants as well. So the third thing I want to talk about, or the fourth image by Manet of a woman of color that I wanted to discuss, is that of the biracial mistress of his friend, the poet Charles Baudelaire. Her name was Jeanne Duval. She was, her mother was of Haitian ancestry. We think Jeanne Duval was born in France itself. We don't know. We think her mother was a brothel worker herself, and an unknown French father. Jeanne Duval actually forged a pretty interesting acting career for herself in the 1840s, and that is when she met Baudelaire. They were a couple. She was his mistress for over 20 years, well into the middle of the 1860s. It was a controversial relationship. Baudelaire wrote a volume of poetry, Les Fleurs du Mal, Flowers of Evil, today known as the one of the foundational volumes of modern French poetry, which was, in large part, in its individual poems, a tribute to this fraught relationship he had with Jean Duval. Cycles of spectacular breakups, reconciliations. She moves out. He says he can't go to the Louvre unless she comes with him because he can't look at works of fine art without her. That type of turbulence, I think, is what Manet is portraying in these billowing white skirts and fluttering curtains. So again, he's not trying to show Duval as she actually looked. He was giving us an impression, not just of her look, but her personality and the life circumstances in which he met her. Part of why I'm showing Jean Duval and Baudelaire here together with Laure is that we have another piece of information about Laure that comes not from Manet, but from Tabourin, the first archivist of Manet in the early 1920s. He knew the son of Manet who inherited his estate. And through documents that I have not been able to access today, Tabourin suggested that it had been Baudelaire who had given Manet Laure's name and the dress, Rue Ventimille. Jean Duval herself lived just a few blocks away. She very much lived in the same neighborhood that we've been talking about. There were cycles of poverty and luxury, but she had an apartment with her own servants, and he maintained an apartment for her mother near the Gare du Nord. So this is Jean Duval. As a last look at the 19th century, before we move into across the Atlantic, I show this juxtaposition to give a sense of this world in which the relationship of Baudelaire and Jean Duval took place, the world of the demi-monde. The demi-monde was a term, half world, coined by Alexandre Dumas, the Black French writer who was a close friend of Manet. And manifested in this play, La Dame aux Camélias. That was a very successful play of the 1850s. Manet was particularly close to Dumas fils at the time that this play had its very successful premiere. There are accounts that immediately after the post-opening party, Manet and his wife and Dumas fils and his wife went off on vacation to the coast of Normandy. But I show Dumas here, caricatured in popular culture as kind of the patron saint of these fallen women, the Traviatas, the demi-mondaine, because the Dumas play became the basis for the Verdi opera, La Traviata, that is one of the best known and beloved operas of the day. And it was just so interesting for me that in the middle of working on this project, the Opéra de Paris does a new production of La Traviata, featuring this, making explicit this connection to Manet's painting Olympia, which it featured in reproduction, life-size reproduction on the set. Oh, I have one more stop in the 19th century. This acolyte Basile, we looked at his studio, we looked at him hovering around Manet together with the Impressionist Monet and Renoir. And I should mention that part of why we don't know Basile's name today as well as we know Monet and Renoir is that these paintings were made in 1869-70. This was 4 or 5 years before the first Impressionist exhibition, which was held in a studio of Nadar, the painter, the photographer that we looked at earlier. But Basile was killed in the Franco-Prussian War at the end of 1970. So what we're looking at are 3 paintings that he made within that year. He then is drafted or volunteers for this war and is one of the early casualties. So he was not around by the time the Impressionist became the Impressionist. But still, I come to this juxtaposition as a way of pointing out the influence that Manet had on these emerging artists like Basile, like the young Impressionists, as he exhorted them to turn away from scenes like this gorgeous Orientalist painting that we have and make scenes of modern life. There was actually a study for this painting, La Toilette, in the studio scene that we saw. Basile finished that painting, submitted it to the Salon in the middle of 1870, and it was rejected. He'd shown a couple of things at the Salon, but he decided at that point to give up and follow his true passion, which was to accept Manet's urging to turn away and just paint these everyday scenes. So you'll see this black woman portrayed in La Toilette in that prototypical mode. She's bare-breasted. It's an Orientalist setting, exquisitely painted, exquisitely rendered. A virtuoso display of Basile, the young Basile's painterly talents. And it's rejected. Working with that same model, he immediately starts working on a couple of flower paintings, including this one from the National Gallery in Washington, where he portrays her not in these scenes from tradition, the Academy, and the past, but as a flower vendor. Another role, nannies, sex workers, actresses, artist models, flower vendors. There were photographs and prints of French Caribbean women, entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs having their stands selling foodstuffs and flowers on the street corners and at the world fairs in Paris. So this is an evocation of that aspect of modern life. This painting is often considered to be a tribute to Manet. She proffers peonies, which were known to be Manet's favorite flowers. He had peonies gardens at his country estate. He did 2 entire series of still lifes of peonies. So by proffering these, adapting the figure of the flower-bearing black woman, placing her in the scene that he could well have observed on the corner of the street where the studio that we saw was located, and proffering these peonies, he is essentially paying homage to Manet for helping him to decide to become this painter, a modern artist. And we see this kind of loose brushstroke of Manet in the rendering of this still very stylish, very specific white dress that she wears, but he is now turned away from the past and embraced the current moment. So that brings us into the 20th century. The transatlantic world of the 20th century is part of what I've tried to convey in the second half of the Posing Modernity exhibition. And I wanted to specifically look at 2 of the early schools of 20th century modern art. One, the School of Paris, founded by by Henri Matisse, whose drawing of the Haitian dancer is depicted here, as well as, of course, Pablo Picasso. And in the United States, the modernists of the Harlem Renaissance, African-American artists who were remaking the imagery of African Americans from rural and stereotyped and tied to slavery to being urbane city dwellers in the middle of the great migration that was taking place in the first 30 years of the 20th century. So the thing that these artists had in common that again kind of conveys what the life of an artist looks like today is that they both worked transnationally. The Harlem artists who had were known to have often spent periods of time in Europe, and specifically in Paris, because of the limited opportunities due to racial segregation in art schools. I'll mention a little bit later that the Art Students League by the 1930s and 40s was a noted exception to that type of discrimination. A couple of these Harlem Renaissance artists had very close ties to the Art Students League. But the Harlem artists went to Paris. They studied the old masters. This is 50, 60 years after Manet, all the way back to the Renaissance. Then they came back to the US. And as Manet did in the 1860s, painted everyday scenes of the major cities of the US, the new black cities of Harlem, of the South Side Chicago, etc. Meanwhile, Matisse, in particular, comes to the US for the first time. And part of what he encounters is the Harlem Renaissance. And we'll take a look at how I believe he adapted his style in affinity with this black modernism that he saw in New York. But first, we see Matisse, before he came to America, working in the 1910s, the 19-teens, with, in this case, two models, including the his very famous and frequent model, Italian model, Laurette, in her characteristic green and black robes. And a model who's a little bit less well known to us today, but was quite well known at the time. She was of Martinican heritage. Her name was Aisha. She was initially a circus worker, but she ultimately became a very well-respected artist model, including for Matisse. So here we see these two models in scenes that evoke 19th century Orientalism, the attire. But these could never be mistaken for 19th century paintings because of the absolutely 20th century nature of the flat pictorial plane, the flattening of these figures, the mask aesthetic, the African mask aesthetic, that the School of Paris, Picasso in particular, but also Matisse, looking at African sculpture, brought into the language of European modernism. And also, again, a certain egalitarian aspect of the way that they are shown together. Initially, the painting on the left, copy, might seem to be the typical black servant, white employer. But if you look closely, some people see this as these two women, Laurette with her espresso and Aisha bringing her glass of tea. In the Middle East, if you're portraying the Middle East, you would show tea not in a cup, but in a glass. And they're taking a break from whatever work that they share together. And looking at this painting, which we were really lucky to have, courtesy of the Matisse family, from a lender who declined to be identified, we really see this kind of egalitarian relationship in an even more direct way. They're colleagues, they're friends here, and they're represented in a pictorial style that is utterly of the early 20th century mode of modernism. And just a note that this kind of egalitarian treatment of this black model, Aisha, would be very much how Matisse and the other artists who portrayed her would know her in life. I'm showing just one of literally dozens of photographs of Aisha, who was a doyenne of Montparnasse Cafe Society, the Dome, La Coupole. She was feted at parties, and this is a scene showing her with her friends and admirers on the terrace of the Rotan Cafe in Montparnasse. So that's Matisse before he comes to New York. And at this time, as I mentioned, we saw the unfolding of the Harlem Renaissance, where the Harlem artists were, on the one hand, portraying venerated elders, many of whom, in the case of this subject, Anna Washington Derry, had been freed from slavery, okay, a moment of enlightenment here. During the American abolition of slavery in 1865. Okay. This revered, this venerated elder, Anna Washington Derry, portrayed, by the way, by the first woman artist, Laura Wheeler Waring, that we've seen in our exhibition, Again, scenes, a woman like this would have been seen perhaps on a farm in the South in the aftermath of Reconstruction. Dairy focuses particularly on her hands and her face. I think this is one of the most exquisite renderings of a visage that I've seen, certainly in our show. Just showing the wisdom and the wiseness, the character of this woman who's basically seen everything in her long life. And then we have the young city urbanite, the city sophisticate, young girl in a red dress, stylishly attired, represented in a manner that captures the mask aesthetics, the pictorial flatness of the modernist style of the time. But still, just totally, as the historian Rick Powell wrote, unabashedly black, beautiful, modern, and with an interiority that allows the viewer, she presents herself to the viewer, or she is presented to the viewer by the way, Charles Alston, who was an African-American painter, who was a teacher, was an instructor here at the Art Students League for several decades, beginning in the 1930s. So Alston made many master works of the Harlem Renaissance, and this is one that we have in our exhibition. William H. Johnson captured another aspect of the modernizing objectives of the Harlem Renaissance as articulated by its founding philosopher, Alain Locke. Portray everything that you see about African American city life. We have the matron, the middle class matron, school teacher, minister's wife, businesswoman, elegant, reserved, not at all playing into the stereotypes of performance and blackface and that type of thing that would have been a more typical image of a woman who looks like this at the time. And using kind of the modernist interest in non-Western cultures. William H. Johnson was particularly interested in folk art, and you see some of that in the way he's portrayed this figure. But he's not going to portray just the bourgeoisie. He is going back. He's working with the nude odalisque as well, but beginning this long-standing project of African-American artists, of African diasporan artists, of placing the black female figure in the center of the image, as the center of attention, as the object of desire. But also being able to kind of send that up a little bit. Some people see a certain raunchy, kind of irreverent aspect of this painting. He's evoking Cézanne with the still lifes, but he's also evoking Manet's Olympia, but with a figural type, a full-bodied figural type that would almost never have been seen in this pose by the artist portraying the white body. This is a black body and being presented in an unabashed way. And that is the world that Henri Matisse steps into when he comes to New York on 4 occasions in the 1930s from Paris on his way, actually from Nice, he was living in the south of France at this time, to the Barnes Foundation in Marion, just outside Philadelphia, where he had accepted a commission to make the famous dancer murals. And we know that for each of these 4 visits, Matisse stopped over in New York, coming and going. It was the port of entry to the United States, and stayed for a week or 2, sometimes more. And that is, those visits are well documented. The New York Times chronicles his visit to the Metropolitan Museum, the gala dinner that was given for him by the Rockefeller family, but less well known, in fact, not really known at all, and known only through the letters that I kind of stumbled across, that he wrote to his wife and daughter. Matisse was also coming uptown, coming from Midtown uptown to Harlem, and going to jazz clubs. We believe that One of the people who may have been with him was Carl van Vechten, a well-known photographer who made many images of Harlem luminaries at the time, including, as you see here, Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday. Matisse's son Pierre also had a very well-established gallery in New York at the time. And we see Van Vechten portraying Matisse in a way that he's almost never been seen before, definitely kind of laid back and relaxed and looking like he's open to refreshing his aesthetic vocabulary. And we very much see that in the work that he made with black models a decade later when he finished the dancer murals and took a couple of sabbaticals, went to Tahiti, and then settled back into his work. So here we see Matisse, and this is what brought Matisse into this narrative for me, coming across a 1947 new edition of Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal. We talked about Les Fleurs du Mal as Baudelaire's poetry volume written in large part in tribute to his biracial mistress, Jeanne Duval, in the 1850s. So here is Matisse making a new edition of this poetry volume and working with a well-known, not highly famous, but well-known Haitian dancer, Carmen Lyons, who posed for the illustrations that he made for specific poems in the poetry volume, Les Fleurs du Mal, poems that Baudelairian scholars have described as being part of his tribute to Jeanne Duval. So again, we see kind of this vacillation from tradition to modernism and everything in between. He's clearly experimenting, developing his single line mode of drawing, his signature single line mode of drawing. But what we also see is affinity. We see the face that he's pulling from this model, Carmen, influenced by the aesthetics of African masque, clearly in this drawing, which was intended to be the frontispiece of the volume and was posed by Carmen, and is very similar, just formally, to a portrait of Essie Robeson, the wife of Paul Robeson, that was inscribed to Carl van Vechten in the 1920s, before Matisse came to New York. There was a relationship between the Matisse and the Robeson family. They visited each other, etc. So affinities, another drawing posed by Carmen in comparison with Carl van Vechten's portrait, New Negro style portrayal of Billie Holiday, not as an entertainer, but as a sophisticate with sort of a contemplative demeanor that was the way that this very extroverted, very public performer chose to present herself in portraits that she sat for. A second body of work that Matisse was making at exactly the same time that Carmen was posing for the drawings of Les Fleurs du Mal was a series of paintings that were his final easel paintings. Matisse was elderly and ill by this time, and this was the beginning of the end of his painting career. He worked with a young Congolese journalist, Belgian Congolese mother, Belgian father, who was a friend of the Matisse family. She was married to the Belgian attaché to Nice. They lived in a villa or a pension, a residence not far from Matisse. She was friendly with artists and writers who were in Matisse's circle. And so here we see Matisse posing this journalist, whom he referred to as Madame Van Eeft, Elvira Van Eeft, in kind of this mid-40s modern style, a very delicate treatment of the mask aesthetic, not the very vivid manner in which Picasso and Cubism worked with that particular style. But the markers of ethnicity that for centuries had been attached to portrayals of the black female figure just kind of drop away here. The turban, the earrings, the ornate jewelry, the exotic attire. She is just a 20th century sophisticate, painted in the same way that he painted European models. And in my mind, how was it that he was able, for the first time in his career, at a time when he was in his 80s, to decide to portray the black female figure in this trope? I think certainly he saw ideas. He may have been able to deduce ideas for this from what he would have observed of the artists of the Harlem Renaissance, whom he knew and met through Carl Van Vechten. So we see Charles Alston and we see Matisse, seated, gaze to the side, contemplation, highly stylish. The William H. Johnson in particular, I was really struck by sort of the patterning of these two women's attire, and also by the specific placement of their hands, this kind of boneless, almost vegetal structure. So this was mid-century modernism. And I'm going to, on my third to last slide here, closing out on Matisse with this portrayal in his final style of art making, the paper cutout, the cut paper painting. This is a portrayal called Creole Dancer that his friend Aragon, who was a friend of Madame Van Eve, described as a portrayal of the African-American dancer Katherine Dunham, whom Matisse saw perform in the 1940s. We've forgotten a little bit about Dunham today, but she was just as famous in Paris then as Josephine Baker. And when you come to the exhibition, you should take a look at the costumes, photography that we located showing what he may have been evoking in this monumental cutout. I point out, again, an affinity between Matisse's late style and the mid-century modernism of Romare Bearden, another African-American artist with close ties to the Art Students League. I believe he studied here for a couple of years in the 1940s. And I was really struck when I looked at the records of his registration here to see that he registered in the name of Howard. I've never heard Romare Bearden described as Howard Bearden, so that was a revelation. That is a revelation for art history. But so Romare Bearden is working in collage, influenced by his teacher here, George Gross. And this kind of commonality, this formal affinity, again, between the African-American and the French transatlantic artists, both pulling from African, from European, and from everyday life, pulling from all of these influences to make the work of their time. And that is where I'll leave you, which is where we are today, looking at these two paintings by global contemporary artists, living artists who are very much active on the international scene right now. And I picked these two paintings to show the living legacy, the continuing legacy of this imagery of Manet and the Impressionists, but also of Matisse and Bearden. You look at Mickalene Thomas's Den No. 1. She subtitles it with the exact phrase that Manet used to describe the model Laure, une très belle négresse. She's making it with the sort of patterning that she admired in the paintings and photography or prints, drawings of Matisse. And this rhinestone applique onto the painted surface is emblematic of the collage that she admired by Romare Bearden. And then a younger, an emerging artist, a young French artist, Elizabeth Colomba, also inspired by Manet's portrayals of Laure, but also thinking about what aspects of Laure's life were left out of art history, were not portrayed by paintings of the time. So here, she attempts to use the painterly techniques of academic painting in Manet's time to portray Laure, not in a studio scene, but in her own life. So we see her walking through the streets on the way to her studio session with Manet, And she's got some nice references to Olympia there. We see the patron who Olympia is probably refusing, bringing his bouquet of flowers. We see the ornate wrought iron gates of the Parc Monceau in the background. Manet's studio was near the Parc Monceau, and the overall composition is reminiscent of Caillebot's Rainy Day. So here's an artist very much living in among us today, an emerging contemporary artist, a black French woman who is looking back at this history, as is the African-American woman artist Mickalene Thomas. And to a degree that has never existed before in art history, we are seeing these two artists and other artists, women artists, artists of color, but really artists of all nationalities, all backgrounds, inspired by these early modern portrayals of the black female figure in a way that has led them to interrogate and deconstruct and reimagine this imagery in a way that allows them to make works that most of us recognize as emblematic of our own time. And in that way, they're repeating they're doubling down, they're keeping alive the legacy and the exhortation of Manet from the 1860s. So with that note, I'm going to stop and thank you for your extended time.